The other night at the dinner table, my daughter asked one of my favorite questions. How did we get to talking about this? Do you ever do that? You take a step back from your conversation and think, what twists and turns did our conversation take that brought us to this point? You might end up talking about something you never would have started off with, but as you go back, you can retrace your steps and see just where your thoughts and people's experiences took the conversation over time, and it took you probably way far away from where you began. We have one of those moments today as we follow along the story of Joseph, or at least the people surrounding Joseph. Because if we read starting in Genesis 12, we expect that we're going to read a story about Abraham's family in the land of Canaan. That's where God called Abraham. And at this point, we have Jacob and his 12 sons, and that's where we would expect this story to be taking place. Instead, we're going to pick up our story today in an Egyptian prison, listening in on a conversation among prisoners, and then we're going to go to the court of the Egyptian king. How did we get here? Well, you can go back to previous sermons and you can find how we got there, but the point is, we are way off of center of where we would expect this story to be. And so we're going to start in on that conversation with Joseph and a couple of his fellow prisoners. And the reason we're doing this is because God shows up in so many ways. As you're going to see in the first verses that I read, God is with Joseph every step of the way. And what that means is that all of the people around Joseph are encountering God in some way as they come into the proximity to Joseph. And we're assuming for this Lenten series that we are not Joseph in the story, that we're not the hero, and wondering how might we encounter God or learn about what our encounters with God might be like if we look at them through the lens of these other characters who encounter God through Joseph. It's a practice of decentering. So let's pick up in Genesis 39. This is right after Potiphar has condemned Joseph to prison. And this is what we hear. But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love. He gave him favor in the sight of the chief jailer. The chief jailer committed to Joseph's care all the prisoners who were in the prison. Whatever was done there, he was the one who did it. The chief jailer paid no heed to anything that was in Joseph's care because the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made it prosper. Again, this is the same thing we saw in Potiphar's household. God is with Joseph and bringing blessing wherever Joseph goes. Sometime after this, the cupbearer of the king of Egypt and his baker offended their lord, the king of Egypt. Pharaoh was angry with his two officers, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, and he put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard in the prison where Joseph was confined. The captain of the guard charged Joseph with them, and he waited on them, and they continued for some time in custody. One night they both dreamed, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were confined in the prison, each his own dream, and each dream with its own meaning. When Joseph came to them in the morning, he saw that they were troubled. So he asked Pharaoh's officers, who were with him in custody in his master's house, "Why are your faces downcast today?" They said to him, "We have had dreams, and there is no one to interpret them." And Joseph said to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Please tell them to me." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So again, we're asking the question, not what we would do if we were Joseph in this situation, but what if we're the cupbearer and the baker? What happens when they encounter Joseph, this Hebrew prisoner servant? Well, we might ask the question, how do we look at the people who serve us? How do you look at the grocery store clerk, the landscaper, the dishwasher? A lot of us go around life and there's just a lot of these other people, a lot of these servants are just scenery in our lives. And it's also true that we don't expect these people generally to really tend to our emotional needs. We just expect them to do the job. As some people would say about like an umpire in a baseball game, the best umpire umpire is the one who no one notices. That's often how we approach these people who serve us all around us every day. And we see in Joseph here that the cupbearer and the baker have come into contact with someone special, a person with integrity and compassion, a man who goes out of his way to notice them and give them space to give voice to what they're going through. Now, again, this is not that Joseph is so great. It's that he is an icon in the story of Yahweh's character in this place that is seemingly so off the beaten path of divinity or blessing or human flourishing. God has shown up in this Egyptian prison among prisoners. And when they come into contact with Joseph then, they are encountering this divine glow in this dark place. And what I want us to notice as they encounter God through Joseph is that Joseph or God doesn't fix their situations. Joseph goes on to interpret their dreams. And for the cupbearer, his dream, Joseph decodes. It means that he is going to be restored to his position as a servant of the king. The baker, on the other hand, has a dream that Joseph realizes is about how the king is eventually going to execute him. He's not going to make it out of prison alive. Joseph does not fix their situations. He isn't the reason the cupbearer eventually gets restored. And he certainly doesn't fix the baker's problems, but both of them found a compassionate presence and honest voice from God in this foreign prisoner servant, Joseph. Now I'm going to jump ahead in the story for just a moment because the cupbearer comes back into play in the story as he alerts, eventually, the Pharaoh to Joseph's gift. So I'm going to pick up at the end of chapter 40. This is after the cupbearer gets out of prison, and it says, "Yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him." So Joseph gave him this encouragement and compassion in this dark time. He just forgets Joseph, right? How many of us can identify? We receive the blessing and then we forget the blesser, right? But here's where we get back into it. After 2 whole years, Pharaoh dreamed that he was standing by the Nile, and there came up out of the Nile 7 sleek and fat cows, and they grazed in the reed grass. And I'm going to skip the dream for right now. If you want a quick version of it, you can listen to the Pharaoh's song in the amazing Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. It's a great description of the dreams and fun as well. But anyway, I'm skipping ahead to verse 9. It tells about Pharaoh's dream, and Pharaoh calls in magicians to help him understand it, and they can't. It says, "Then the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, 'I remember my faults today. Once Pharaoh was angry with his servants and put me and the chief baker in custody in the house of the captain of the guard. We dreamed on the same night, he and I, each having a dream with its own meaning. A young Hebrew was there with us, a servant of the captain of the guard. When we told him, he interpreted our dreams to us, giving an interpretation to each according to his dream. As he interpreted to us, so it turned out. I was restored to my office, and the baker was hanged.' Then Pharaoh sent for Joseph, and he was hurriedly brought out of the dungeon. When he had shaved himself and changed his clothes, he came in before Pharaoh." So, I just want to notice right now that there are all kinds of these bridge characters in the scriptures, and I want to give them their moment because it's important as we decenter ourselves that there are times where we might be these bridge characters. Because again, there is no hermeneutical principle. That's a big fancy preacher word. Hermeneutics is how we read a text, the lens with which we read a text. There's no rule about reading the scriptures that tells us that we must read ourselves into the center of every story. There are all kinds of people who play just a small part in bringing about God's purposes. People like the cupbearer. Now let's be honest, he's a little self-absorbed and dim, right? He just forgot about Joseph for those 2 years. He doesn't bring any real substantial wisdom or integrity or compassion to the story. He just so happens to forget about the guy who was there for him in his hour of despair and decoded his dream. He gets what he wants and forgets about this amazing foreigner, prisoner, slave. He's living a centered life, if we could put it like that, until he isn't. Just for this one moment, And maybe because he thinks it will benefit him, maybe he thinks it'll get him in the king's good graces, he goes out on a limb and recommends this foreign prisoner slave to the most powerful man in the known world as a dream reader. I mean, the chutzpah on this guy. And he becomes, in this one moment, a bridge for blessing. No, he's not the Pharaoh running the show, and he's not Joseph, our Spirit-anointed hero, but he just bears witness in this particular moment to the work of God in his life. He's a bridge of blessing. Some of us are under the illusion that we have to fit ourselves into that hero slot in the story, or else we're not doing God's work. We have to be the pastor or the missionary or the radiant, smiling Christian all the time. Maybe we just have to remember that dark time in our lives when God showed up and bear witness to it at the right moment. Not all of us have to be Joseph. And if you're reading the scripture thinking that you have to be like all of these heroes, who aren't even really that much of heroes oftentimes in the story, incidentally. But if you're thinking you have to be that center character all the time, that can be a crushing load to bear as you read the scriptures. There are all kinds of roles to play in God's story, and the cupbearer is one of these bridges to blessing. He plays his role in this moment of the story by bearing witness to that dark time when God showed up in a dark place for him. Okay, so let's move on. We're going to move on to Pharaoh now. It's another encounter of the dreamers. This is part 2 of our message today. And we're going to start, we already read that part. I'm looking. Okay, we're going to start back in verse 9 where he comes to Joseph comes to the king. Or verse 14. Then the Pharaoh sent for Joseph, and he was hurriedly brought out of the dungeon. When he had shaved himself and changed his clothes, he came in before Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, I have had a dream, and there is no one who can interpret it. I have heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. Joseph answered Pharaoh, It is not I, but God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, In my dream I was standing on the banks of the Nile. And he goes off again on this dream about cows and corn and all of these wild things, or grain, I should say, not corn. And we pick it up in verse 33. Joseph gives him the meaning of the dream, 7 years of plenty and 7 years of famine. And then this is what Joseph says. I love this. Now, therefore, let Pharaoh select a man who is discerning and wise and set him over the land of Egypt. And I wonder if Joseph is kind of like, who could that be, right? Let Pharaoh proceed to appoint overseers over the land of Egypt during the 7 plenteous years. Let them gather all the food of these good years that are coming and lay up grain under the authority of Pharaoh for food in the cities, and let them keep it. That food shall be a reserve for the land against the 7 years of famine that are to befall the land of Egypt, so that the land may not perish through famine. The proposal that Joseph gives him pleased Pharaoh and all his servants. Pharaoh said to his servants, Can we find anyone else like this, one in whom is the Spirit of God? So Pharaoh said to Joseph, Since God has shown you all this, there is no one so discerning and wise as you. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall order themselves as you command. Only with regard to the throne will I be greater than you. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, See, I have set over you all the land of Egypt. Removing his signet ring from his hand, Pharaoh put it on Joseph's hand. He arrayed him in garments of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. He had him ride in the chariot of his second in command, and they cried out in front of him, Bow the knee. Thus he set him over all the land of Egypt. Moreover, Pharaoh said to Joseph, I am Pharaoh, and without your consent no one shall lift up hand or foot in all the land of Egypt. Pharaoh gave Joseph the name Zaphenath-Paneah, and he gave him Asenath, daughter of Potiphar, prince of On, his wife. Thus Joseph gained authority over the land of Egypt. Quite a rise to the top, right? But it's important for us to remember that the people reading this story, the people in the context where this is written and being read in the first place, are people who don't have a high view of pharaohs. The last Pharaoh they knew was trying to keep them from getting out of slavery in Egypt and then trying to chase them down when they actually did get out. So for Jews, or for the Hebrew people who are reading this, and for Jews even to this day, the figure of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, is an evil figure, is a symbol of all that is evil in the world. And so we have to get that context here, because the writer is flipping this whole perception on its head. He's messing with the people. Because here, instead of this arrogant, power-hungry king, we have a king who simply doesn't know. We have a king who doesn't bluster or BS, but who recognizes his limits and asks for help. We have a king who takes wisdom from a foreign prisoner slave and recognizes the Spirit of God in him. Did you hear that when Pharaoh said, "Can we find anyone else in whom the Spirit of God is, like in Joseph?" That's what he's saying. He sees the Spirit of God in Joseph. So in other words, we have a king who is more discerning of God's Spirit than God's chosen family, the family that had rejected Joseph. And as the story goes on, we have a foreign king who receives God's promised blessing through Joseph. And then it is Egypt that blesses the family of Jacob when famine comes to that family who had rejected God's blessing. The whole story is flipped on its head. It's just like one of Jesus' parables. The bad guy becomes the one who discerns God's Spirit and brings blessing to God's chosen people, who they were the ones kind of playing the role of the bad guy in rejecting God's blessing and rejecting Joseph. I think this has a lot of bridges to our modern moment as the church. The church right now is paying the price for acting like we are the only Spirit-anointed ones in every circumstance. We have the knowledge of salvation, and everyone else are heathen sinners who need us. And this is a colonial or an imperial version of Christianity that carries over into the church today. This view that we have it all, that we know it all, and no one else knows anything, of value anyway, has justified all kinds of atrocities throughout the history of the church. Whether we're talking about the slaughter and displacement of Native American tribes, whether we're talking about slavery, or whether we're talking about the continued centering of the European American story as we view the world and tell history. All of it comes from assuming that our faith means, the implication of us having faith in Jesus means that we are chosen and have everything that others need, while others have nothing to offer to us, nothing to teach us. But what if we're not always Joseph in the story? What if sometimes we're Pharaoh? What if sometimes we could just not know? I mean, what if we could be like the Pharaoh who's the king of Egypt, but in this moment, and people think that he's like connected to the gods. And yet in this moment, Pharaoh says, I don't know. I can't figure it out. What if we as the church could have permission to just say, I don't know. I don't have an answer. What if we as the church could sometimes just bear witness to the human experience of just being perplexed? What if we could just recognize the limits of our own wisdom and be able to discern God's wisdom in unexpected people? So much of church life in this moment is about defending our center place, at least the church in America. Why people should come to our buildings, why others should believe the book we say we believe, why others should accept our standards of morality, why they should just receive the Jesus we're telling them about because we have the answers. And if they want the answers, they should think like us. What if in this moment, we don't just need the wisdom of Joseph, but the humility of Pharaoh? What if the way God wants to show up to us is through the friend of a friend who might just blow us away with spiritual wisdom if we would just admit we don't know, we need help, and listen? What if that is what we take away from the story today? Instead of assuming that we are the Spirit-anointed ones in every situation, we might ask where we might need to humble ourselves ask for help, and be willing to see a divine spirit in an unexpected place, a foreigner of another faith in this case, just like Pharaoh. What the cupbearer and the Pharaoh share in this story is their encounter with God through an unexpected foreign prisoner slave. They see something that God's chosen family do not. They are open to the Spirit's movements in a person to which God's chosen family were closed. And we realize that this is a theme throughout the Scriptures. It is so often more difficult for God's people to see and get on board with what God is doing than it is for the outsiders and the outcasts. So there are some religious lenses that we religious people tend to put on that obscure what others seem to see. We want to, and I think this comes from our desire to rewire the whole story into a system that tilts God's blessings in our direction, instead of compelling us to show up where God actually shows up, in those dark places, in those prisons, in those foreigners, in those servants. We want God to come to us in the center, while God is beckoning us out to the margins. And friends, we scramble to be at the center because we assume that being at the center of the story, being at the center of our society, being at the center of our family or our church, or the church being the center of society, we assume that being at the center is where we are best positioned to receive blessing. But in this story, God is constantly showing up on the margins. And so if we want to truly receive God's blessing, well, we need to go where God is. It might be on the margins with people who have been left out and left behind and lost, people we've been told to be afraid of, people we have been told are not untouchable. It might be with those very people that God is at work and that where we need to go if we're going to get right into the center of God's blessing. We have to ask ourselves at some point why God's people are so often, throughout the whole story, so obscure, so often persecuted and oppressed, why they so consistently end up unjustly imprisoned and exiled and crucified. The Scriptures center a marginal group. Israel was never the biggest or the wealthiest, or oftentimes they weren't even the most upright nation in their society. They were a small nation among empires. And so how is this a story that keeps getting told? And I wonder if it's not so much about it being Abraham's family themselves, but about where God breaks into the world, with whom God identifies, how the loving and gracious and liberating presence of God shines out into this world. It's a story about Israel because they weren't the great empire everyone thought was at the center. That's how the story is told, and that's why it's told the way it is told, because God is the one who shows up outside of the center. That's why God dwells with them and eventually comes into the world as one of them, as an Israelite himself, as a descendant of Abraham. The central problem of the story for Israel and the church is that we keep wanting to be the empire in the center of the story, while God keeps decentering his own presence from the worldly centers and focusing his work and presence among those on the margins. Isaiah says as much. In Isaiah 53, we read, he was talking about the servant of the Lord. He was despised and rejected by others, a man of suffering and acquainted with infirmity. And as one from whom others hide their faces, he was despised, and we held him of no account. Surely he, this suffering servant, has borne our infirmities and carried our diseases, yet we accounted him stricken, struck down by God, and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the punishment that made us whole, and by his bruises we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have all turned to our own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. In other words, the true servant of the Lord is the one who's decentered by his own people, by all the people who are, by the empire, by all the people who are scrambling to be the biggest and the wealthiest and the most powerful. They reject him, and yet he is the one who saves us. Salvation is on the margins. Jesus himself says as much when he tells the sheep in his parable that the one who gave the hungry person food, the thirsty person drink, the one who welcomed the stranger and clothed the naked and visited the prisoner, those are the ones who have encountered Jesus on the margins. Peter Rollins says it this way. He picks up on this theme, and as he asks questions about how we even serve others as the church, he says, instead of assuming that we're the heroes when we serve the poor, for instance, when we serve people who are experiencing homelessness, for instance, he says, what if the homeless population, we don't go to bring salvation to them? What if they are our salvation? What if we're not good news to them? They are good news to us because they expose a problem in our culture. Instead of trying to get rid of the symptom, listen to what it's saying. They are our salvation. The outsider is our good news, because that is where God is always at work. Peter Rollins says that God is at work exposing the illnesses and injustices of our society when we come face to face with the homeless population or the prison population or any kind of other. He says God is speaking powerfully in those encounters on the margins. And it's one thing, a good thing, not to isolate ourselves entirely from those spaces. So it's good when the church steps into those spaces, but it is even more good, it is even better to ditch the hero attitude and see them as the very face of God and to hear God's voice in their lives. And so perhaps, just because we're Christians, we're not exempt from the uncomfortable and disorienting work of seeing and hearing God in the face and voice of the other. Maybe the church is less the hero figure in the world story and more a witness to the way in which the world is saved through a God who shows up on the margins, who dies outside the city, and begins a movement with a message and group of people we would never expect or choose. We bear witness to that not only by telling this story, but by actively seeking God in the other, in the foreigner, in the prisoner, in the oppressed. Not because they are the heroes either, but because that's where the hero just keeps breaking into the story, into the world. Now, this makes me uncomfortable. I like to be the one with the answers. I don't necessarily want to look into the eyes of someone else and realize that I am somehow complicit in their suffering. I would rather condemn homelessness as a function of individual bad choices, and the prisoner as well. But this story won't let us do that. Otherwise, we condemn Jesus too. If Pharaoh, who had as much reason to believe that he was the center of the universe as anyone, if Pharaoh can honor the Spirit of God in a foreign prisoner slave, then surely we who are baptized into the life of the crucified God can swallow our pride for a moment and do the same. And so as we examine our own faith journey and our own system of beliefs, our own spirituality, I think it's important today, as we look at this story through the lens of the Pharaoh and the cupbearer, how much our faith is really about affirming our desire to be at the center of it all. And here are some clues that we might want to examine. If other ways of thinking about our faith, other ways of seeing Jesus, other ways of understanding God and God's work in the world, if those are to be rejected because they don't fit with what you already know, that might be a sign that your faith is really about, reassuring yourself that you're already at the center. Nothing else, there's no other room to grow. There's no other different thing to learn. I'm at the center. If other religions are to be primarily feared and not like just listened to and say, where is their wisdom here? Where might God be somehow moving in these? that might be a sign that we're really just trying to make sure we're on the right team. If you feel like you or the church, you need to defend that you or the church have everything to offer others and nothing to gain from them, then that might be a sign that our faith is really about affirming our centeredness. If you find yourself shaking your head at the people at the bottom of society and thinking, oh, they must have made some bad choices, rather than listening to what they tell us about the kind of society we live in, again, we're missing the God who shows up on the margins and speaks through those people. If you want people to only be around people and have experiences that reaffirm what you already believe, rather than to be around people and experiences that invite you to grow or learn, that might mean that you've built this system to make sure that you're at the center. By the way, I do all of these things too. There are elements of my own faith, there's elements of my own daily life where I look at them and I say, yeah, that's really just about making me feel good about being in the center of it all, and not about where God is really at work. But friends, I am more and more convinced that Jesus' ministry wasn't about just gathering people into the right religion so that they would be within the radius of the tractor beam that extracts people up into heaven one day. Jesus' ministry was about embodying the presence of God, who brings freedom, healing, and new life wherever there is captivity, disease, and death. And the people who follow Jesus go with him, not just follow his example, but actually join him in that work in those places. Jesus' purpose is for the healing and liberating grace of God to permeate all creation that is captive to sin and death, and thus for the whole earth to teem forever and always with the glorious goodness of God. And we find this God hard at work when we look where Pharaoh and the cupbearer found God hard at work: in the foreigner, in the prisoner, in the oppressed, in the other. That is where salvation and healing and liberation begin. That is where the crucified God is found. That is where our hope of encounter, of redemption, can be discovered. Amen.